Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Sanchali. Sanchali, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Tom. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Sanchali. I'm the founder and CEO of Commons, and I'm so happy to be here.
Fantastic. And what is Commons?
Commons is an app that helps people use the power of their spending to create a more sustainable world. Essentially, it's a mobile app that allows you to track, reduce, and offset the emissions of everything you buy. And I built it after my own personal journey of tracking my carbon footprint manually for many years, finding it to be a very difficult experience, but also a very
Mhm.
rewarding one that allowed me to build a healthier and more sustainable life. And so I built the tool to make it easy for anyone to access that. I think tracking your carbon footprint and managing carbon as a metric should be as easy as managing our dollars or managing our calories.
Okay. And first of all, I guess, why? Why did you start on this carbon tracking journey initially? What was the genesis of that?
It actually started for me when I was in college. I was a senior in college and I saw the documentary Food Inc. I happened to see that documentary when I was an economics major and I was also the manager in my dining hall. And it got me thinking about the power of our food choices. And I wanted to know there must be some through line between the choices I'm making in my life and these larger systems that I'm studying in school and I want to change. So, what is that link and which of my choices matter, if any? So, I started using carbon tracking as a way to look at that through line. And what I found was that my choices do matter, but maybe not in the ways that I expected. After I saw the movie, I felt like, oh my gosh, I have to be vegetarian and I have to do that for the rest of my life. But what I realized after carbon tracking was that every meal matters. And it's the cutting down from 12 times a week, which is how I was eating meat before, to one meal a week, the biggest delta in my carbon footprint. That additional marginal one meal a week doesn't make a huge impact. So I could still keep meat in my life for the rest of my life, but drastically reduce my meat consumption and have a big carbon impact. And so that's basically what I've did over the last 5 years. I've eaten about one meat meal a week, or rather, sorry, over the last 10 years, I've eaten one meat meal a week. And over that time, I've taken 5 cars off the road from a carbon perspective, just through that one action. And I continued carbon tracking over other parts of my life. I started to expand my Excel spreadsheet into my travel and my home energy use. And over 6 or 7 years of making those choices, I started to reduce my emissions by about 30% from my starting point. And I actually was saving money. I was saving about $2,000 a year by doing
Ah,
that.
nice.
And I felt healthier, happier, like my life was more aligned with my values. So I discovered that carbon tracking, when used in conjunction with understanding a person's lifestyle, could actually be a tool for living a more abundant life or a more fulfilling life. And if all of us did that together, then this is pretty massive impact we're talking about. 65% of global emissions are actually influenced by household spending. So we together, through these massive shifts, can make a big impact. And that's what I set out to build Commons to do, was to make that easy, because no one wants to use an Excel spreadsheet to manage their life.
And where were you sourcing the data for the emissions that you were tracking?
So initially, I was just doing it myself through online research. I ended up taking one course on carbon tracking, which helped me. But with the tool itself, we actually have been working with experts since day one, with academics at MIT and Yale, as well as our own team who has expertise in this area. And we combine data sets from national, local, and regional data sets. So, for instance, we use information on US level emissions for wooden furniture. Let's say you made a purchase at a furniture store. We would use a US and national emissions estimate. But say you purchase gasoline, we would use a local zip code level estimate for the price of gasoline in your area that day. And then we combine that with information that the user provides us about themselves, not only their financial transaction data, if they choose to connect their credit or debit card, but also some of the aspects of their lifestyle. For instance, how often they eat meat will affect the carbon footprint of their grocery purchases.
Okay. And so you've mentioned it's an app and you've mentioned the possibility of connecting debit or credit cards. walk me through the app itself in a little more detail. Obviously, I'm guessing it's Android and iOS, and you download it from one of the app stores. What happens after that?
Yes, it's Android and iOS. It's available in the US and Canada. You download it. The app will ask you if you're interested in tracking your carbon footprint. If you are, you can connect your credit or debit cards to the app. We use the API Plaid, which is the same API that Venmo uses, Robinhood uses, all of our major fintech apps use for secure banking connections. And we read transaction level data and output the carbon emissions of every transaction that you make. So we might see that you spent $50 at the gas station. And in Oakland, California, that day, the price of gasoline was $5 a gallon. So you bought 10 gallons of gasoline, and we'll give you an emissions estimate associated with that purchase. For something like groceries, it's a little less precise. We see that you spent $100 on groceries. We know that you eat meat one meal a week. You'll have a lower carbon footprint than someone who spent $50 on groceries, but maybe ate meat every single day that week. And then finally, if you have really broad purchases, something like Amazon or a retail purchase, that's where we can get the least precise, but we can give you an accurate estimate over multiple purchases. And the goal is to really give someone a sense of a carbon intuition, an understanding of what are my emissions from this type of activity relative to another type of activity, so that I start to build the same kind of intuition we have for dollars or calories, a sense of what balance looks like. We're never going to get to zero. There's no such thing as a zero carbon footprint life if you're living in society in 2023, but there is such thing as a balanced life, and we can help people develop that sense of balance. So it's that understanding, oh, my meals matter about as much as my transportation choices. So my total gasoline bill is about the same as my total food purchasing carbon footprint. So the choices that I make in those areas are both pretty consequential. And within that, the choice of protein that I eat is the most consequential for food. So that's the one I'm going to focus on. Or for travel, gasoline is my biggest and flights are my second. So that's how I'm going to spend my time and effort. Sometimes people might be surprised at the carbon impact of shopping. It's something we often don't think about. Something like our
Mm,
clothing purchases actually have a lot of embedded carbon in them and can also be very consequential choices. And so then through using the app, people start to develop that carbon intuition. They start to get personalized analytics on their emissions and their biggest opportunities for impact. The app then also allows you to discover ways to decarbonize different parts of your life, everything from shopping secondhand for furniture to composting to switching to a greener bank account. These sort of large, sometimes surprising actions that can lower your carbon footprint dramatically and send a signal to companies that we want a more sustainable economy. And then finally, for all of the emissions that you can't avoid, there are offsets. And offsets are far from perfect. They're not a magic eraser, but they are another way to express demand for carbon to be reduced and removed in our global carbon economy. And we help people pick the most effective carbon projects and then offset exactly what they consume. So it becomes a bit of a feedback mechanism. So if you have a lower carbon footprint that month, you'll pay less in carbon offset. If you have a higher carbon footprint, you'll pay more. We do have people who pay as little as $10 a month. We have some people who pay $1,000 a month for their carbon footprint. And most people are safely in the middle, somewhere around $20 to $30 a month.
okay. And I'm assuming the offsetting is voluntary. You don't have to.
Completely voluntary, and it is the only part of the app that you pay for. So the app is free to use. The community is also something you can engage in. You can meet other people in the app who are also lowering their carbon footprint by and living a more sustainable life. You can discover other tips and recommendations from people who have taken actions like the ones that you are taking. And if you choose to offset, then that costs money, but it is totally voluntary.
Okay, fantastic. And you said you've launched on the App Store in the US and Canada, so North America. Are there plans to go beyond that?
We would love to go beyond that. I think the biggest challenge is a data challenge. We've worked really hard to build our carbon models on carbon accounting for the US and Canada. And different countries have different carbon economies, or different structures of their carbon economies. So we will probably expand beyond the US, but just not yet.
Okay. And why do our spending choices matter when it comes to global emissions? Why? Make that link for
It's
me.
it is important to remember that the climate crisis is none of our fault. And eco anxiety is real as well.
Mm.
We don't want to be a tool that actually exacerbates people's eco anxiety. The tool is there to help you take action in ways that make your life better and make the world better. And so I think we start from a premise of the climate crisis is not your fault. And also, it's not that every single thing you do matters. There's no way that all of us can fully decarbonize our lives by ourselves. We need policy, we need companies to change. However, that doesn't mean we're powerless. And I think it's really important to recognize that number, that global emissions number, that 65% of global emissions are directly influenced by household spending. And essentially, carbon emissions are directly correlated to GDP and to incomes. So that means that higher income people have the highest opportunity for lowering emissions while also maintaining a high standard of living. And that is exactly what the UN's IPCC report said last year, 2022, that the people across the world in the top 10% of global incomes
Hmm.
are those who have the greatest opportunity for lowering global emission. And if you live in the US, that means people who make over $60,000 a year. So if you make over $60,000 a year, you have more influence than most people in the world over our shared climate trajectory. And with that opportunity, we also need to focus on the choices that matter most. So if you have, only two or three things that you can do, say in a month, really well, what are those two or three things going to be? You want to focus on the things that are at the intersection of achievable and impactful. And that's what the tool helps you do.
Okay. And how does it help you do that? For example, you mentioned clothing has a pretty high impact on your carbon footprint. Does it, for example, say this manufacturer as opposed to this clothing manufacturer? Or is it a question of saying, well, maybe you should consider going to a thrift store next time, Tom, instead of, or how does it help make those choices?
Yeah, so we're starting to incorporate more insights into the product. That means that when you see your data, let's say you'll go into your carbon footprint for the month and you'll see my largest carbon purchases were clothing and restaurant.
Hmm.
Then it'll suggest people like you who have this kind of carbon footprint are taking this action to lower it. And what you might find is you might find an article or a guide to help you understand that type of action. So that might be something like people like you are starting to shop secondhand. You can see the carbon impact of shopping secondhand. If you shop secondhand, your carbon footprint would be 50% lower from your next clothing purchase. And then you might find an article that helps you understand, how do I start shopping secondhand? What are the key things I need to know to start doing that? In some cases, we are starting to incorporate some vendor level estimate where we have confidence that there's a lower carbon alternative. So, for instance, in the case of a supermarket versus a farmer's market, we have confidence that a farmer's market has a lower carbon than a supermarket. So, we can suggest that to you in your action. But company level estimates are quite hard, and we want to be a bit careful about incorporating them. So, generally, what you'll find alternative spending options or principles. It might be something like secondhand shopping, or it might actually be something as specific as switching your bank account from a Chase account to a Capital One account could have a huge carbon impact. That's something that was surprising to me to learn, that our
Oh,
bank accounts have a large carbon impact. So that kind of guidance is in the app.
and talk me through that. Is it because the different banks have different policies on where they invest your money?
Exactly. Our large retail banks lend against our deposits, against their retail deposits.
Mm.
And the biggest banks tend to lend quite a bit of money to fossil fuel companies. In fact, for instance, Chase is one of the banks that's lent the most to fossil fuel companies. And over the last several years, the total amount that banks have lent to fossil fuel companies could have been enough to decarbonize our entire grid. So this is large magnitude of capital that we're talking about, really significant when it comes to global emissions and our shared trajectory. So there's been a big push in the last few years as more research on this has come out to inform consumers about how their deposits are being used, potentially against their will. Many of us don't wake up in the morning saying, I wish that my savings account would fund fossil fuels. It's just something that happens without us knowing about it. And so what we do is we reveal information in the app to users about where their bank is investing. So if you are banking with one of the banks, there's 12 banks who funded the most fossil fuels in the last 10, 15 years. And so if you are banking with one of those banks, we'll let you know and we'll tell you what your impact savings could be by switching to a bank that's not one of those 12. And then we'll provide some guidance on which those banks are. So that that is one of those actions that might be surprising. You can do it once. You can have a huge impact every year from now on by doing that one action.
Yeah, fascinating. And talk to me about the offsets, because offsets have got a very mixed reputation, shall we say. There are, I mean, there's been several, I don't want to use the word scandals, but there's been several exposés, shall we say, of instances where offsets have been shown to be, shall we say, generously shady at best. How do we get around that? I mean, what are you doing to make sure that the offsets are certified, legitimate? How do I know that if I buy offsets through Commons that they're permanent, for example? So if I were to buy offsets in a forest somewhere, what happens if there's a wildfire and the forest burns down? All that carbon goes up into the air.
That's a really important perspective to have. I think the scariest thing to me about offsets is that people think they're perfect. And
Mm,
that can cause a lot of problems. There is no such thing as a perfect offset. If you would like to reduce emissions or you want to know that they've gone down, you probably need to do it yourself to be 100% confident that that's going to happen. So whether that's you making sure that, I did not drive my car today, so I know that those emissions were not released. That's an example of something you can have full confidence in. But paying someone else to protect a forest somewhere else in the world, there's definitely risks associated with that. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And I think that's also a really important point is that we do need to protect our natural capital. That's such an important carbon sink for us is our trees, our forests, our soil, our oceans. They're incredibly valuable resources to protect. And right now, in the absence of our economy protecting them, carbon offsets are creating an incentive for people to pay to protect them, which is really critical, or to subsidize really effective technologies that can reduce or remove carbon, like direct air capture or mineralization. These are really early stage technologies that have shown promise for scale. And in the models that our experts and the IPCC are developing, they're going to play an important role in reduce getting us to net zero by 2050. However, there's risks associated with novel technologies. They are not perfect yet. And all of those things are critical as someone is developing an offset strategy. So we tell our users to think about offsets like you would think about stocks. You hope they're going to go up and to the right. You hope they're going to sink all of the carbon that they can, but you're not 100% sure. You wouldn't buy into a stock and know for sure that it was going to give you a return. However, if you build a diversified portfolio, you have a higher chance of maximizing your return. And we do that with offsets as well. So we curate the best offsets that we can find. Our team does a lot of diligence on them. We also collaborate with other major rigorous buyers, large companies or nonprofits. We share our research openly on those projects. You can find our evaluations for our projects on our website, very detailed evaluations of them. And so we pick the best ones that we can find in each of the categories that we see are critical to get us to net zero by 2050: ocean, forestry, soil, and then longer term, more permanent carbon removals. And then we construct a portfolio for our customers, just like the best corporate buyers are doing for themselves. And a one that balances risk across things like technology risk, natural capital risk, additionality. All of those things are things that we look at. And we balance that portfolio. We're currently at $25 a ton. Over time, we'd like to increase the price of that portfolio
mm.
because longer duration carbon removals, more permanent carbon removals are more expensive. And as we move closer and closer to 2050, we need to increase the proportion of permanent removals in our portfolio. So that is the way that we approach offsetting is not as a perfect magic eraser, but a way to express demand for effective climate projects around the world in a way that can maximize impact.
Okay. And what do you say to the argument that it's a bit like speeding tickets or parking tickets? It's just you can pay and then you can park wherever you want as long as you're willing to pay the fine, or you can go as fast, you can drive as fast as you want as long as you're willing to pay the speeding ticket. Similarly with offsets, you can pollute as much as you want as long as you're willing to, pay for the credits.
I think the idea of paying for pollution is really challenging. And in fact, one of the biggest issues with it is the underlying inequality and injustice associated with it. The climate crisis is fundamentally an issue of inequality. And that's why thinking about our spending and our incomes is a really critical part of thinking about how we tackle the climate crisis, because those of us with more means are also the ones who will be most protected in the case of crisis. And so I think a lot personally, and we think a lot together about how offsets cannot just be a license to pollute. They must be associated with accountability for reduction. And that's why in our offset subscription, it's tied to your actual emission. So if you emit more, you pay more. If you emit less, you pay less. You can't just pay a flat amount and say that you are fully climate neutral. Ideally, everyone is using it kind of like a tax on carbon, a way to regulate their own emissions. Now, of course, this is fully voluntary and this is still pretty new. So not everyone wants to pay exactly what they emit. You might look in the app and find that, it's a few dollars more than you're comfortable paying. We do allow people to set a max in the app of their comfort for paying. So if you say, I'm willing to pay my full footprint up to $20 a month or up to $50 a month, but beyond that, I'm not willing to pay it. We do give people that option in the app because this is fully voluntary. Ultimately, we would want there to be regulation to say that, carbon is disclosed at the point of purchase and is paid for by companies and is accounted for in consumer decisions as well. But in the absence of that being true right now, we have a way of revealing that carbon impact and allowing people to transact in the carbon economy even before the government has given us the information to do so.
Okay. What about things like gamification, leaderboards, all that kind of thing? Are you building that in? Have you built that in as well to the app?
We do a little bit of it. We have found that with something like climate, which is people are so intrinsically motivated, there's very mission driven element to it, that people tend to like more of the collaborative atmosphere than the competitive one. It
Okay.
can be a bit scary to be able to show someone your carbon footprint. Again, it's fully voluntary. We want to encourage people to be part of this community. So your carbon footprint is for you to look at. No one else can see it when you're participating in the app. However, what people can see is the actions you've taken to live a more sustainable life. And so people can go to your profile and they can see, oh, Sanchali has started eating more plant-based. She's started greening her bank account. She's flying less. She's offsetting her flight. They can see all of the actions I've taken. And those badges are something that you can see and look at for others. And then we're starting to build in more community elements. As I mentioned, you can see tips from others in the app. You can see a feed of how other people are taking action, get inspired. And we're starting to allow folks who have more experience, who have expertise in living sustainably to actually share that guidance with others in the community. And there's some light gamification, things like, with your own data, you can see your changes over time, how you compared this month versus last month. You get a little, green badge when you're doing better than the month before, and you can feel really good about yourself. So we're definitely leaning into some of those elements where we see things that are working in other areas and helping people get that little boost of adrenaline from living more sustainably too.
Okay, cool. And it's very much a consumer focused app. Are there any plans to go to enterprises and businesses as well with it? Or are you going to stick with the consumer focus?
I think we do see a big opportunity in the consumer space. There are a lot of carbon accounting solutions now for the corporate side, which is excellent. And it's an area that needs to move quickly so that there's better data on corporate emissions and more accountability for those companies to take action. And hopefully we can be the place that actually helps share that information with consumers. So when consumers are curious, what are the companies I'm buying from actually doing and how can I use my demand as a tool to show them what I would like? That's the platform that we're building.
Okay. And what are your kind of 3, 4, 5, 10-year plans? Where do you see yourself going?
Yeah. I think that 5 years from now, if we're successful, what we'll find is that the modern consumer will include carbon in their decision making. We include cost, convenience, but carbon is something that's very difficult to include in our decisions right now. We, as a generation of consumers and the generations before us had no carbon consciousness. And that resulted in us building our lives in ways that were out of balance with the Earth's natural carbon cycle. But we have this new generation of consumers coming in now, a group of consumers who's much more aware and much more motivated to align their spending choices with the Earth. And I think what we'll find is that carbon intuition will be mainstream in a few years. It will be strange for anyone to make a purchasing choice without knowing the carbon footprint of that choice in a few years, just like it would have been, it would be strange for someone to make a purchasing choice without knowing the dollar value of that purchase in much the same way. And I think that as we've seen, consumers have changed very quickly. The way we consume now is nothing like the way we consumed 10 years ago or 100 years ago. We also have seen that people have gotten very used to a new mobile app type. So there's lots of new mobile apps that didn't exist before. We have apps for managing our finances, for managing our health and fitness, for managing most recently our mindfulness and our meditation. And next, I think it's also going to be that we'll all have a climate app on our phone. And hopefully that app will be coming.
Nice. Nice. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Sanchali. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I think that I think one thing that we haven't touched on is that there can be a lot of skepticism about the power of individual choices. And rightfully so, and no one person can change our climate trajectory by themselves. And at the same time, I think it's the only thing that ever has, as a group of people making choices differently is the only thing that ever has changed our life on Earth. And so I think it's a really important perspective. And of course, I feel skepticism and despair and powerlessness just like anyone else when it comes to thinking about this really daunting thing we have to do. But I also feel hope and inspiration and confidence knowing that if we study history, humans change all the time.
Mm.
And we change our behavior all the time and how we live all the time. It was actually one thing I'll leave you with that was really just mind opening to me was realizing that over half of global emissions that humans have caused have been emitted since the year I was born. So I was born in 1990, and over half of all human caused emissions have been emitted since the year 1990. And we have until 2050 to get to net zero. I'll be 60 in 2050. So my lifetime, my actual lifetime is the small blip in the Earth experience that the worst of the climate crisis or the most consequential time for the climate crisis is happening. And for all of us, anyone who's alive on Earth right now, that means that we are here in this very special window in which our shared future, planetary future, is being determined. And I think that's both like pretty scary and also really empowering to know that the climate crisis isn't this thing that was, way in the past or is going to be way in the future. It's 100% our present. And we have this really golden window of opportunity, and we need to use all of the tools that we have to make a difference, whether that's, voting in the next election, organizing with your local community, writing a letter or petitioning a company to change their practices, and using every spending choice we make 2 or 3 times a day to try to make that difference and demand signal.
Okay. Just a left field question before we wrap up. What about things like labeling of goods? Because right now, very few items have their carbon footprint labeled on them. I know of 1 or 2 things that I can pick up and look at the carbon label on it. Making that mandatory will surely make an enormous difference. But on the other hand, would that, if it did happen, make your app redundant?
I don't know that it would make it redundant. I would be thrilled if that happened, regardless. We need more carbon labels in more places. We need more carbon information. I think there's still a place for a tool that helps people holistically make choices about their life and connect with others to see the impact we're having together on those choices. So I wouldn't be worried about it. I would be very excited. I do think realistically we're quite far away from all mainstream products having carbon labels on them. I would love to see regulation to change that. But the data is extremely challenging. Doing a bottom up life cycle carbon analysis of every product in the economy currently is extremely expensive and time consuming. And it's probably years, if not maybe a decade away from being in a place where we could have carbon labels on everything that are actually accurate and trustworthy. And I think that we don't have to wait for that. We can move a
Mm,
lot faster with a tool like this. It's not 100% accurate. It's not going to be perfectly granular for every product, but it's going to be maybe 80% accurate, good enough to get a relative sense of the biggest impact drivers in your monthly carbon billing statement. And so that's where I think we start. But at the same time, would love to see that happen and would love to see how we can help the Commons community advocate for that too.
super. Great. Sanchali, that's been fascinating. If people would like to know more about yourself or Commons or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
They can find us at thecommons.earth website or on Instagram at thecommonsearth or on Twitter as well.
Fantastic. That's been great, Sanchali. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Tom. This was really fun.